Hey, it's been a while.
My bad.
But it was worth the wait, because I created the first ever multiplayer Plants vs Zombies RPG. Full disclosure, this is technically a part 2, but don't click away. This video can be watched without having seen the first one, I promise. Okay, you're still here? Good, let's start. Because I have an insane 12 pages of messy notes to get through for this video.
The zombies are coming.
Because I'm a big, serious YouTuber now, I bought a better PC. Editing on the previous one was such a drag, so that should be better now. This does mean that I have to export the project to this new PC. I also playtested it a bit after I exported it, and wow, there are still so many bugs in this project. I really should not have published the game in this state. But you live and you learn. For example, something I learned through experience when working on the first version of the game. There were moments where I accidentally permanently altered a file or a model, and I just could not get it back, so I had to redo it from the start. We're not doing that this time. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using a version control system. For those of you who don't know what that is, it is essentially just a way to keep track of changes made to a project. It saves those changes so you can always just take them back, or even just like take bits and pieces of the previous version and put it into your new version. It's really handy. It's also a really good thing if you're working with multiple people in a team, because multiple people can just work on separate branches and then all the changes can be reviewed and merged back into the main branch. But since I'm working alone, it is pretty much just a way for me to save all the changes I made, so I can easily go back to an older version if I mess something up, which I definitely will. Not to mention, it's also a great way to get footage for a YouTube video, because I can easily show the state of the project at the time of the note I'm currently talking about. I will be using GitHub to host it. It's kind of the most well-known and it's pretty simple. Okay, so I pushed the whole first version of the game onto my GitHub repository. This ended up being 2,687,459 lines of text. That's not just code though, like it also includes image metadata, Unity settings, and everything else that can be written in a text file. From here on out, I would diligently commit and push my changes to my repository. Yeah, that's a lie. I know this update is supposed to be the multiplayer update, which is kind of what I'm going to be naming it, but I decided to first fix the most obvious bugs, so I would have a good foundation for converting the game to multiplayer. For example, the big ones were the bouncing P move getting triggered twice if it simultaneously hit two objects on a final bounce. Fixing this was kind of just a waste of time though, because I ended up scrapping that move anyway, but that comes later. The Sunflower's wand beam kept going through the pause, so when the player paused, it would still keep going. This was also an issue with the face beam. Fixed that really quick. And another big one was that the door to the room to go to the next room sometimes activated before all the enemies were dead. I wasn't fully sure what the cause of this was, but that entire feature was done really sloppily, so I just kind of improved it, at least I think I did, and just hoped for the best. Anyway, blah blah blah, let's get into the actual multiplayer. I did some research on what networking solution I should use. The main three are Unity netcode for game objects, Mirror, and Fishnet. I ended up going with Fishnet because apparently it's newer, faster, and easier. But then again, the person that claimed this was a Fishnet dev, so who knows. At first, I tried just throwing it into my already existing project and just hoping for the best, hoping it would work. Yeah, no. This is pretty much the main reason why this video took so long to come out. All this networking stuff was so complex and so far outside of my area of expertise, it literally had me reviewing networking logic charts just to try to get an idea of what to do. I was having some issues with spawning the characters. As you can see, the Sunflower is way back there, but you're only moving the peashooter around, yet the Sunflower's attacks work. It's weird, but to properly spawn the characters now that I have Fishnet in my project, I have to make sure that every plant inherits from a network behavior class. This is because every plant should be a network object, but you can't make it inherit from two classes at the same time, so my characters could not inherit from the character class anymore. That's a really big issue because in a lot of scripts I rely on the player character, so all the plants inheriting from a character class. If that changes, a lot of my script will not work anymore. Also, I really feel like I should explain to you all how network objects work. So basically, with the way my game works and the way a lot of games work, is that there's a host who is also a player, and everyone else are just non-host players. Every player, hereafter referred to as a client, has their own copy of everything in the scene. This includes non-network objects, which are just objects that don't move and /or aren't affected by network objects. Think walls, floor, obstacles, stuff like that. They also have a copy of network objects, which are objects like enemies, player projectiles, stuff that should move and should be controlled by the server. The host / the server then sends information of the network object state at a fixed time interval to the non-hosts, so they can replicate the object state on the server as previously mentioned. And finally, there are network objects that that have an owner. So player characters, for instance, are spawned in with the specific client's connection attached to it. So because every object is replicated on every client, every script also runs on every client. So in every script, you have to really make sure that each part of the script only runs on a client it is supposed to run on. There are multiple ways of doing this that all have a different functionality. The most basic way to do this is to use an if is server initialized or if is server started. Anything wrapped in this will only run on the server. There also exists, of course, if is client initialized and if is client started. Anything wrapped in this will only run on clients. This will also run on the host, of course, it just won't be put on the server part of it and thus won't try to force it to also run on non-hosts. There are also if is owner checks, which is useful for player input, for instance. The owner should be the only client that can pass inputs to its attached player character. And then finally, you also have remote procedure calls. Server RPC, observers RPC, and target RPC. They are all attributes you can put above functions. Server RPC can be called by the client to run a specific piece of code directly on the server. Observers RPC can be called by the server to run a specific piece of code on all clients. And target RPC allows you to put a specific network connection into the function, and then that specific piece of code will only run on that specific client. I get it if you thought this was kind of dry and a little boring, but it's pretty much necessary for you to understand networking and for you to understand my process. Besides, with the explanation I just gave you, you pretty much already know more about networking than I did at this point of the project. Alright, so my notes say I spent about an hour converting the peashooter class to an interface. I'm sure it took way longer though. I converted other classes to inherit from network behavior and I changed some to interfaces. All in all, this took about 10 hours total. However, I eventually came to a painful realization. This project cannot be converted to a multiplayer game. The foundation is just fully wrong, so I did the only thing that made sense. I killed previous version and started over. So I created an entirely new project in Unity. I will rebuild this new empty scene with the bits and pieces from the old project that are still usable. This of course meant first making sure player movement works again. Player camera will come after that. I changed the way player relevant managers work by removing it from the scene and just putting it on the player character itself. I managed to get shooting to work on all clients, including non-host clients, but on non-host clients it looks kind of bad because it sends the object to the server, then retrieves it again, which makes it really jittery when spawned because there's kind of like a latency issue there. This will be somewhat fixed later, but don't get your hopes up. Remember how I said that every client has their own copy of every object? Yeah, that became an issue here, because every client has their own copy of the player's variables. With the way I had implemented it, the non-host player had infinite health and ammo. The reason for this issue was that the ammo amount was being changed for the client, but the ammo check was being done with the ammo amount of the server. The best way to fix this issue is to make sure that all the relevant variables for every client's copy of the player object are always synced up. So I tried using syncvar, which is a synced variable. It's kind of like a variable with an observer's RPC built in. The server sets the value and then every client receives that new value. But using syncvar with interfaces is a nightmare, so I had to switch back to the abstract character class inheritance system that I used for the first version of the game. So those hours upon hours of converting to interfaces and then trying to make that work was for nothing. Great. However, I did end up figuring out that I could just make the character abstract class inherit from network behavior, and then when the actual classes like peashooter inherited from character, it would also inherit from network behavior. It seems really logical now that I know more about game dev, but back then, that thought did not even cross my mind once. Okay, so the way that every client notifies each other about their location is through a network transform component. You just stick it on there on the prefab and Unity will do the rest. However, the standard Unity network transform seemed kinda inaccurate for the player characters, so I bought a package from the Unity store. It's called SmoothSync. Thank you to the person that donated to my itch.io page when I still had that option open, by the way. SmoothSync was bought with that donation, so you are the real MVP of this video. Also, thank you to everyone who supported the first part and everyone who tested the game and gave me feedback. SmoothSync seems to be a bit better for player movement. It seems to be a bit more accurate. There are still latency issues though, and spoiler alert, they will still be there when I finish this update. I will have to fix that in the next update, although suggestions are really desired here. Anyway, now that I fixed the inheritance issue, I started properly converting all the player characters and their movesets to multiplayer capable versions. The sunflower took a long time to get working. About 12 hours I'd say, and most of those 12 hours was spent on fixing the wand beam. Syncing a line renderer that goes to a mouse cursor over a network was not easy for me at all. Besides, the complicated wand beam start and stop logic also had to be converted. Phase beam was way easier, but that move is just active for a specified amount of time, so it doesn't have to take player input into account. Besides, it only goes in the forward facing direction of the sunflower, so the mouse location can be ignored. But after having done the sunflower, the pea shooter was kind of easy, because I both started understanding how fishnet works, and pea shooter doesn't have an annoying beam. Okay, finally, something fun. I started working on the walnut character. I've gotten a bit better at creating 3D models, at least since making the pea shooter, and I quite enjoyed making this one. The fact that he's a walnut and the way he's designed makes me think he was supposed to be some kind of tank. I had to get really creative for his moveset though, because how is this plant that has never moved, besides being bald that one time, supposed to attack any zombies? I cannot give him a bowling move, because that would just be way too mobile for a tank class. That also got me thinking about how I would eventually animate this character. Sunflower and pea shooter are easy. I'll just steal the solution the shooter games came up with and just make them walk with their leaves, right? The walnut, however, does not have leaves and seems kind of like a static object. I'll probably just have him hop instead of walk, although I do wonder if I'll decide to implement the hopping as a feature of his movement. Anyway, the walnut has a melee primary where he headbutts a zombie. But I received some feedback on Twitter. Follow that if you want to get updates on things I'm working on, by the way. Follow that now. So the headbutt melee became a faceplant semi-melee. His secondary is kind of cool. It's a shield charge meter. It's fully unlike anything that's already in the game. It goes down when you hold it and when it absorbs damage. So the best strategy is to use it right before you take damage instead of just holding it down. So it'd be kind of a bit like a parry, which I think is cool. And here's another concept that's not in the game yet. Spawnables. Walnut's utility ability spawns a little walnut companion that will take some aggro off of its owner. His first special ability is similar to what I had originally planned for the walnut's ultimate move, Walnut Bowling, except he doesn't bowl himself, he bowls a little exploder nut. The exploder nut rolls towards a zombie, and the first thing it hits, it explodes and damages everything around it. As a primarily melee character, it's easy to get surrounded, so his second special move is this ground pound that knocks away and briefly stuns all surrounding enemies so he can escape. And his ultimate really plays into the tank role. Iron Maiden has the walnut taunting every enemy in the area and encasing himself in spiked metal armor. Every zombie is now focused on attacking the walnut, regardless of what other plants are nearby. The increased weight of the armor makes his physical attacks land harder. The faceplant does more damage and has more range. Ground pound does more damage, more knockback, and has an increased radius. The spikes add a Minecraft Thorns-like effect to him. Every melee attack landed on the walnut causes the attacker to also take damage. And finally, walnut in its normal state has an upgradable armor stat that decreases incoming damage. When the ultimate is active, walnut's armor stat goes up, further decreasing incoming damage. Be careful though, because this heavy armor makes the walnut move a bit slower. And just a fun fact, walnut's ultimate used to be something completely different. It used to be this phalanx thing, but that was kind of terrible, so I scrapped it. Iron Maiden was his utility ability, although it was a way weaker version of it. And Dummy Nut wasn't even a concept at that time. So moving on, I wanted to get started on the walnut sound effects, but I always end up jumping from one thing to another when I decide that something is bothering me, even though I probably should just focus on one thing. Maybe someday. At least I started actually using version control again at this point, which I should have done way earlier. So I committed the changes I made for the walnut and basic multiplayer conversion. This commit ended up being 3,179,158 lines of text. Throughout this entire process, I actually just fixed way too many bugs to list them all in this video, because at this point in the script, we're already at the same amount of lines as the previous script had in total, and we are nowhere near done. But I still want to talk about the bugs I encountered at this part, so let's speedrun this. Peashooter's charged P-shot knockback was terribly programmed and somehow made it into the uploaded version of the game. It calculated the knockback direction from the hit point to the enemy location, which means if the P hit the capsule collider slightly on the side, it would get knocked to the side, even though it would be way more logical to knock the enemy into the direction of the P. This was easily fixed though. Just get the linear velocity of the P when it hits the zombie and then just make the zombie shoot into that direction. The next two bugs/warnings really annoyed me. Internal, deleting an allocation that is older than its permitted lifetime of 4 frames, and invalid AABB in AABB. The allocations one is just really weird. I was worried that it was some kind of memory leak, which could be catastrophic, but eventually it was just gone. It just disappeared. I had a lot of different hypotheses, but I never quite figured out the root cause. After a while, I noticed that it only happened when I clicked off the game to click something in the editor. I think it might have been something editor specific, but after a few weeks to a few months of seeing it, it just vanished, so we'll never know. I think it's most likely an editor specific warning though, because I'd get a few of those during this project. Anyway, as for the AABB thing, it only started happening after I added walnut, so I reasoned it out and realized it's probably something to do with the walnut. Walnut. Unfortunately, the warning just really is not clear at all, so it took me a while to track down the error. Something that really threw me off is that the error appeared even while not playing Walnut, and it took me a while to realize that Walnut got 2 warnings. It was because I had a Walnut prefab just kind of rotting there in the scene. It turns out that in the first few frames after the Walnut is spawned, the shield meter UI is being divided by 0, which is not allowed. So I fixed that really quick. The laggy start of every projectile on the non-hosts was really starting to annoy me, because I had just added the Walnut, and because I switched the Walnut melee from a headbutt to a faceplant, the Walnut now also uses a projectile, and that projectile looks really bad with it being this jittery. I attempted to fix it by just overtuning the smooth sync, so I just increased the sync rate a lot and then set the extrapolation to unlimited. This made it a bit smoother, but it's really bad for networking performance and it still kind of looks bad, so this made me start looking for alternative solutions. I came across this fishnet feature called prediction rigid body. This is really complicated though, and to what I could understand seems more suitable for player movement. Perhaps I will utilize this in the future. After some digging, I found a page in the fishnet documentation that talks about lag compensation for projectiles. I decided to give that a go. Adapting this method for the game took some effort. It also more than tripled the amount of code needed when compared to the previous method. I don't fully understand all the aspects of this code, but from what I am able to understand, it spawns a projectile locally for every connected client. It then uses some variables to increase the local speeds to try to make its position match the server projectile's position. It looks good though, so I made sure every player projectile uses this system instead of the previous one. I made a little to-do list based on things I think should be in the game and on feedback I received. We can mostly just ignore the list though, because I certainly forgot about it after a certain point. I added an automatic reload feature that makes the player reload when they're shooting with 0 ammo. I received some feedback on my itch.io page. The main takeaways from this feedback for this update is that the character movesets needed some improvements. So peashooter's dash cooldown has been reduced, his bouncing P has been replaced with a piercing shot that pierces some zombies and does less damage after every pierce. Sunflower's secondary attack was kind of underwhelming and useless, as it was just the worst solar beam, but she's still a support character and thus should not do too much damage with her basic moves. So I kind of struggled to think of a new move for her, so for now I'll just make the wand beam pass through enemies, so it becomes also a piercing attack. So you can just train the zombies like COD zombies and hit multiple at once. Oh, and someone in the comments said that Sunflower's ult should be called Solar Flare, and I agree with that, so that's now its official name. By the way, this feedback is the main reason why I removed failings and created Dummy Nut. So thank you for the feedback, because I think it's overall a really big improvement. I've honestly been working on this project in a bit of an unhealthy way. There were days where I spent like 13 hours on it and I would just do that the entire day, and then at night I would wake up panicked thinking that a certain feature I'd worked on for a while just suddenly stopped working, and that's just the only thing that would occupy my mind at night. So after a bit of that I started taking more breaks, and there were days where I didn't even work on the project at all, just so I can kind of start working on it in a bit of a more healthy way, but that's also kind of the reason why this took a little longer to come out. Alright, time to get the enemies working again. It is a bit of a conundrum because there are a lot more requirements now. The main problem is that I cannot just set the enemy's target as whatever object is tagged as a player, considering that there can now be multiple players, not to mention the fact that the player can now spawn player objects like the Dummy Nut. The easiest way to do this would be to retrieve all objects in the scene with a player tag every so often with the find objects by tag method. But this function is really expensive, especially if there are like 12 active enemies in a scene that all have to keep doing it every second. So we cannot really do that. That means that I need to create some kind of system that keeps track of all player objects, which the enemy can then use to cheaply and easily retrieve a list of players and objects that it should be attacking. It was mentioned in the comment section of the previous video that I should look into the singleton pattern. This ensures that there's only a single instance of a class at a time. This is useful for managers because it can just easily be referenced in any script and there's no chance of duplicate manager scripts interfering with each other. Every single time a player object gets added or removed, it invokes an action. Every enemy subscribes to this action and thus gets notified whenever the amount of player objects changes. When it receives this notification, it will retrieve the refreshed player object list from the player manager. Remember that I said that the door system was sloppily made and that Walnut's ult is supposed to force every enemy to attack him. To solve the door and allow the Walnut to do that in a non-expensive way, I will also need to create an enemy manager that will keep track of the enemies. It is made in a similar way to player manager, but the way actions are used is a bit different. For example, Walnut does not subscribe to any of the enemy manager actions. It instead will just retrieve the list whenever it needs it, which, considering it's only for the ult, will not be that often. The door, however, does subscribe to it, but that's only relevant for when rooms get added back into the project. Wow, this script is already so long. Oh. Okay, Walnut's relatively complex moveset works now, and so does the basic zombie.
I was really missing the game HUD at this point though, so I started working on adding that back.
It honestly is not that hard. I just had to convert it from being a general script and a general UI canvas to being placed directly on the player. So basically, when the player spawns, it initiates a local UI prefab on the client. So every player has their own game HUD, pause menu, level up menu, etc. Also, thank you to the person that sent me some HUD images on Twitter.
I've decided to not use them for this update for now though, because I would like all the images to match an art style. And I would feel bad directly asking for more, but if you're willing to make more, I would gladly use them in the game, because they look really good.
Let's see, skipping some stuff. I debated adding randomly generated rooms, but that's just really not possible for me right now. Or rather, it would work eventually and I could get it to work, but then this video would have come out even later.
And then I worked on adding back more UI functionality. Pausing the game would take some work, because before I only had to check if the singular player had paused the game, but now that it's multiplayer, I have to check if everyone has paused the game. It took me a bit to fix it here, and the solution I came up with kind of sucks in retrospect.
I ended up improving it later, near the end of the video, but it functions now. Every player needs to have the pause menu open for the game to actually pause. When one of them unpauses, the game unpauses for everyone.
Then I fixed some stuff, which I'll do a lot in this project.
When a non-host client runs away from an enemy, especially a melee zombie, the zombie's attack seems to trigger even when the player is not within the range.
This happens because the non-host's position is a bit behind on the server.
So for the zombie, it looks like the player is within range even though they aren't from the player's perspective. It also applies to projectiles and other attacks. It can make the non-host get hit by attacks that should not have hit on their perspective. This is an issue with latency and syncing that I just did not manage to fix during this update. I spent a lot of time on it, but I cannot keep delaying this update in this video. I just have to accept that sometimes not everything can be perfect. That's something that this project really drilled into me. I had to just learn to accept that. If anyone has any suggestions on how to fix this, please share it in the comments. Maybe I need to use the prediction rigid body I mentioned earlier. Moving on though. I fixed more stuff, more and more and more. I made a slight start on creating a revive system. I made it work for now, kind of, but it's shoddy and unfinished. This is on purpose though, because the way I will finalize and handle player death and reviving is fully dependent on how I will implement matchmaking and players connecting in the future. I also converted player XP to a global XP system, so all players will be on the same level and XP even if a player joins late. This was also necessary because the terrible way Player Manager was designed at this point, whenever a player dies or gets downed, they would get removed from the enemy target list, but that same list is also used for managing all the players. So if a player died and is therefore not on the list, that player cannot be managed at all and so will not get any XP. I will sophisticate the Player Manager later, do not worry about that, I hate it as well. Okay, so all of that managing was a drag. On to another fun thing, Nightcap. Nightcap is the last of the plants that were explicitly hinted at being playable characters in the game, so she also has to be in my game, of course. This means though that after I create her, I am fully free to add whatever character I want. Not in this update though. On the prototype screenshots, the Nightcap was kind of plain. I do not want to stray too far from the screenshots when it comes to the main playable characters, so I will just keep her design simple. I envision her as kind of like a rogue or like a ninja, so I thought it would be cool to give her a cloak. But it kind of became this weird cloak-like thing that loops in front as a sort of scarf like her Battle for Neighborville model has. And she has this comically small hood at the back. Yeah, that's not serving any purpose. I don't know, she's kind of plain and kind of just a worse version of her BFN model, but I still like her though. Nightcap as a rogue slash shinobi is proficient with shuriken. She can accurately throw a single one or 3 of them spread out. A rogue needs to be able to hide in the shadows. Shrouded Shroom hides Nightcap's presence from all the zombies, allowing her to get away when cornered. And if that's not enough, Nightcap's first special move is a dash that allows her to dash through any attack and any enemy while also damaging the enemy. Her second special is versatile and can even be used around corners if done well. Moonerang bounces between enemies with strong homing. And finally, her shinobi history has led to her learning the iconic Shadow Clone Jutsu. The 2 Shadow Clones move around and fire slightly homing shuriken at the zombies. The clones will gradually lose energy just on their own, but taking damage also decreases their energy further. When their energy is under a certain percentage, they will forego the shuriken and the wandering and will dash towards the nearest enemy. They will explode either when they make contact or if they are killed while charging. I think that's a pretty cool moveset. Shrouded Shroom took some effort because I couldn't get the Nightcap to switch between the opaque and transparent materials well, and then when I did get it to work in the editor, it would not work in an actual build. But I got it to work, of course, because I am just that good. And Moonerang had an issue where if it bounced to an enemy that's too close, and that's moving in the exact opposite direction as the Moonerang, it would get stuck inside the enemy without bouncing anywhere anymore. But that was also fixed, of course. Next, I added health bars to the zombies,
which was requested.
And now, a big and maybe controversial change. Old cooldowns and Sunflower's Healing Sun cooldown no longer go down just by waiting. It is now based on enemies killed. Every player gets a cooldown reduction when an enemy is killed, not just the player that killed it. Although, it's still technically possible to wait it out. It would only take 16,666,666 minutes, 277,778 hours, 11,574 days, or 31.7 years. But you know, you can do it. Go for it if you want to. And then some more bug fixes, of course. I made the keybind text and ability icons turn gray when a move is on cooldown, because someone mentioned that it sometimes wasn't fully clear when an ability was available if it was like the last few seconds or like last few milliseconds. Okay, back to actual features. I made an imp model that can be used as a base for future imp zombies, like the dragon imp for instance. Right now it will only be used for a basic version of the imp though, which I dubbed the barbarian imp. The barbarian imp will accompany a boss zombie I am making. The prototype images had a gargantuar in them, but he was holding a fish as a gun and I cannot really tell where they were going with it, so I kind of just did my own thing here. I modeled the body with the Garden Warfare gargantuar as a reference, like I did for the imp, but whenever I use a Garden Warfare model as a reference, I have to make sure I make the head bigger and I point the head up, so it's easier for the far away and slanted player camera to see the zombie's face. The model is a bit of a mess, like he even has a spiky eyebrow thing that I just could not get right, but it doesn't look terrible. The aesthetic I chose for my interpretation of this game is kind of like dark, fantasy, medieval, stuff like that, so I chose to make the gargantuar a butcher. I think that kind of fits a little bit. As far as moveset, all the other zombies in the game currently only have one move, but the gargantuar is supposed to be a boss, so I have to give him a good variety of moves. This will be quite the challenge, seeing as I have not done this before. Before I started actually coding the gargantuar's AI, I thought it wise to first plan out his attacks on paper. The gargantuar moveset took a while to create, because it not only takes a lot of time to create each move, but it also takes a while to go through everything, test it, and then fine-tune it. Plus, making models for all the moves also wasn't that fast. But coding the chain swing in particular took me ages, as I really wanted to make its length adapt to the amount of space available. The way I ended up doing this is actually kind of cool, at least in my opinion. So basically it works like this, and listen well. The gargantuar has a chain ring object on him. Whenever it starts a chain swing move, it calculates the shortest distance from the gargantuar's center to objects with the walls and obstacles tag. It then calculates the amount of chain parts that can be connected by using the distance from the gargantuar's center to the start of the chains and then the length of each chain part. The chain ring then receives the amount of possible chain parts and spawns a chain part with that number -1. The chain parts will then recursively spawn more of themselves, until the amount of room left eventually becomes 0. Also, every chain part, including a chain ring, has their own box collider. If a part hits a player, it passes the hit player down to the chain ring. This is to ensure that if a player gets hit by 2 parts, it won't count as 2 hits. Right now, a chain part consists of 2 chain links. This means that when the length is just barely not enough for 2, it will only spawn 1 chain part, and thus will be way too short. I will probably change chain part to consist of 1 chain link in the next update, but this kind of just occurred to me recently, so I did not have the time. I started noticing some changes in myself. I got to a point where when I created a new feature, or just added something in general, I could already make it in a multiplayer way. Like, I didn't have to first create it in a single player way and then convert it to multiplayer. That being said, the gargantuar still had a lot of issues on non-hosts that I needed to fix anyway. Anyway, to swiftly go through the gargantuar's moveset. His melee is a big arcing swipe with his cleaver, although not animated yet, of course. He has an imp barrel that does damage when it hits the player and spawns imps for a bit if not destroyed. There's also a long range cleaver throw that causes a shockwave when it lands and which stays in the ground for a bit as an obstacle. The code for the cleaver throw arch and the spinning was actually insane, by the way. Like, that took me so long. There's also a dash that the gargantuar uses to get in close. Man, the gargantuar chain swing really highlights the non-host latency issues. Wow. There are still some issues where the gargantuar is just not that challenging, so I did something I don't really like to see in games myself. I just threw in a lot of extra mobs in the room to kind of help the boss out a bit. I will try to make the boss more self-sufficient later, but for now this will have to do. Anyway, I wanted to add another zombie to the game, because why not? It needs some more variety, right? I took that as an opportunity to also rework the base zombie model, because the topology of that is such a mess. It is horrible. Maybe it looks slightly less detailed than the previous one, but its topology is so much better. It also went from an insanely ridiculous 322,673 faces to a way more reasonable but still probably a bit high 35,892 faces. This should help with performance when the models get animations in the next update, because the less faces there are, the easier it is for your PC to calculate how the faces should move when animated. Oh, and something fun, I also gave the bow and arrow zombie the elf-like model from the concept pictures. I even gave it 2 color variations, like like you can see in this concept art. So the zombie I wanted to create is kind of like an intermediate step between just a regular zombie and the boss. Like he's stronger than a regular zombie, but still not a boss. I decided to make it a wizard zombie because I think that would fit the theme quite well. I wanted to be a bit more creative with this model though, so I chose to not just copy the wizard zombie models from PvZ 2 or BFN. Instead, I found this medieval painting online that I used as a reference for his design.
The wizard zombie has a projectile attack where he sends out 3 spread out orbs. He also has a big laser beam attack. This attack is meant to limit the player's movement options. And of course, he also has a sheep attack. Any player it hits will be sheeped for a short amount of time. While sheeped, the player cannot attack and is significantly slower.
Once again though, non-host players will get hit by the beam even if it doesn't look like it on their screen, so be extra careful. Okay, so for some reason I decided to look around on YouTube and just googled my game's name.
And I found some videos of people playing the game, which was quite cool. I watched this one video of someone playing it and
he did not like how you couldn't really see what was happening under the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, like this is a little bit of a problem. If I go down, I don't know what's going to be there.
so I added edge panning.
I don't know, it's still a bit janky. I might make it static, so whenever you go below a certain point of the screen, it just goes a certain amount instead of like this dynamic one I currently have, but we'll see. Also, if you play my game and stream it somewhere or upload it somewhere, please send me a link on Twitter because it's not easy to find it myself on YouTube.
What else? I made it so that every zombie has a random chance of dropping healing sun when killed.
I will eventually add a more proper way for non-sunflowers to heal, but this will do. I changed the lighting a bit, making it darker and giving it a slightly dark blue hue. I think it does a lot for the vibe of the game, to be honest. Anyway, now that a lot of actual gameplay stuff worked, I thought it was time to add the rooms back because this base testing area is really ugly. I also wanted more room variety and more visually interesting rooms, so I made some more models that I could fill up the rooms with. For the rooms and the gameplay loop, I needed a room manager and the game manager. The game manager is a singleton like the player and the enemy managers. The room manager, however, is attached to every room prefab, so that means that every room has their own unique room manager. The room manager will handle player teleportation, enemy spawning, changing spawn points, and door activation. Originally, going through the door made the next room spawn and then despawn the current room. It then also teleported the player to the player spawn locations set in the next room. All implementations that are similar to that had problems, however. The first one had the issue where both maps were visible at the same time for a frame or two. Then I changed some timing related things, but then there were a few frames where the player camera had moved, but the model had not yet moved. The solution to this was to have two rooms in a scene at once. Basically, when all the players go through a door, a finished room function gets triggered, which will start a delayed despawn of that room, and which will activate the next available room. When a room gets activated, it will then teleport all the players to itself. It then starts spawning enemies, and then finally it will start a delayed spawning for an inactive next room. Oh yeah, so I also added this wave system to the game. It felt kind of unfair for the player though, because they could just be walking around, and then the zombies could just spawn directly around them and box them in, because the player had no idea where they would be spawning. Therefore, creating zombie spawn location indicators was essential. And of course, this also required a wave progression bar that moves from right to left like the good Plants vs Zombies games, and not like the bad one. Anyway, the gameplay features for this update are pretty much done, mostly. So, besides final testing, there are only 3 things left to do. Finalize the menus, add a matchmaking system, and then finalize the dying and revive system. I did randomly decide to just add background music to the game while working on the menus because someone who played the game seemed really disappointed when there wasn't any music, but you know, just another example of me just going from one thing to another.
Look at the main menu and the character selection UI though. They are so much better.
Insane improvement. Genuinely night and day. And wouldn't you know it, the options menu is also functional now, with a few settings that you can change. I'll probably add more graphic settings in the future, but not now. While working on the UI already, I also changed some fonts in the game, because apparently some people just don't like the Unity basic font. Now, for matchmaking. There are a few options I have to consider before I can really start working on this, and it will get kind of complicated, so bear with me here. The main choice I have to make is what kind of hosting I would choose. I could choose out of dedicated hosting where I set up servers that players could connect to, which would be expensive, or I could choose to make a player host it themselves and then have other players connect to them, which is called P2P or peer-to-peer. This does not necessarily have to cost anyone any money. The problem with P2P is that to allow players to directly connect to you, you have to port forward on your modem, which essentially means opening a road to allow users to receive and send packets directly to your network. This is too much to ask of people nowadays, so I will have to just do something that's kind of like a hybrid between the two options. It will still be P2P with one person hosting,
but there will be a middleman that allows the players to connect to each other.
There are a few matchmaking solutions that can be used in Unity. The main ones are Multiplayer Services SDK, which is native to Unity, Steamworks SDK, which is related to Steam, and and Epic Online Services, which is related to Epic Games.
I briefly looked into Multiplayer Services SDK,
which would probably be the easiest to use, but it costs quite a bit of money, so I am not really prepared to pay that. Then I actually got a bit of a start with Steamworks SDK, which you can do by either directly working with the SDK or downloading one of two plugins that make it easier. But the best plugin costs money. And after looking into the other one, I realized I could pretty much only use Steamworks if I decided to publish this game to Steam, which I will not be doing. I could not even do that if I wanted to. Therefore, the only remaining option was to use Epic Online Services. From now on, I will call this EOS. I am not a big fan of Epic Games, but it pretty much is my only option at this point. The problem with EOS is that it is, of course, way easier to use with Unreal Engine, which is their own game engine. Using it with Unity is possible, but it actually is a really big hassle, and the documentation is genuinely horrible. It is so bad. But whatever, I was just gonna have to suffer through it.
There's a plugin that helps with this called the Play Everywhere EOS plugin for Unity. Their documentation is a lot better with actual working links, but the website is still such a maze.
I imported the plugin, which wasn't easy considering the tarball on their website. Also, tarball is kind of like a zip. It gives me a version with a lot of problems, and their copy and paste get URL is the wrong URL, so I kind of had to go looking myself. I also imported a helper plugin that combines EOS with Fishnet called Fishy EOS. I had to first set up a project on the Epic Games creator dashboard. I then needed to put the information from that into the EOS plugin settings so it could find the proper connection. I also had to put an EOS manager in the scene. This will attempt to log the user in using their device credentials instead of just having to rely on having an Epic Games account. Now that I had the beginning of the EOS stuff in my game, I attempted to get the single player working again, because I also separated the single player from the multiplayer with a menu.
The single player has a different method of spawning in the character than the multiplayer. It uses player preferences, which is kind of like a local file on your PC that remembers stuff you chose in the game. Because the character selection for single player takes place in a different scene than the game, I have to remember across scenes what the player chose, which means I have to retrieve it using player preferences.
After I fixed a few more small things in single player, I could move on to creating actual lobbies for multiplayer. Wow, this was difficult. Probably the most difficult thing I've done so far.
Because there's just no thorough tutorial anywhere.
And yet there are so many lines of code that are needed for this to work. It's probably kind of boring to really fully talk about it, but it's also kind of an essential step to making this update work, so here we go. I made a connection manager and a lobby manager. The connection manager works with players' connections.
It also makes sure that when the player closes out of the window with the red X in the top right, the game actually closes properly. After I added EOS, but before I wrote this code, the game would just remain open in the task manager. Both connection manager and lobby manager are marked as don't destroy on load. It's kind of self-explanatory, but this just means that when a new scene gets loaded, these managers will remain active. The connection manager starts whenever the game is opened and never gets replaced. The lobby manager only starts when you go into the multiplayer section. If you then back out of that section and go back into it, the old lobby manager will get replaced. This just made it easier to deal with certain lobby logic. The lobby manager is used to create a lobby, join a lobby, leave a lobby, all that kind of stuff. It is fully created out of bits and pieces I found online and whatever useful information I could get out of the documentation, because I certainly was not going to be able to write any of this without any references. I mean, you can look through the code a bit. I'll show all the relevant sections. Most of it is reasonably self-explanatory, and the parts that aren't, I don't even know if I fully understand those, to be honest. Testing this was such a drag, by the way, because I couldn't just use the multiplayer play mode I was using before. So what I had to do whenever a big change was made, I had to build the game, zip it up, put it on Google Drive, download it on my laptop, unzip it on my laptop, run the game there, run the game on my PC, and only then could I test lobby related stuff. And I had to keep doing that again and again and again. I think I have about 30 different versions in my laptop's trash can. For some reason, the build on the desktop worked fine, while the build on the laptop had issues. It could not log into EOS because it failed to create device ID credentials.
Really weird, really strange.
So I had to remedy this by checking the result code of the first login attempt. If the login failed for some reason, it will attempt to forcefully create a new device ID. And if it successfully creates that new device ID, it will then attempt to log in again.
It finally happened. I managed to get my friend from a different country to connect to my lobby and successfully load into the game. He could move, he could shoot, and it all worked. After literal months of rebuilding and fixing stuff, I was finally playing with someone other than myself. But It wasn't perfect yet, of course.
I had to consider a few edge cases and problem areas with the matchmaking.
Like for instance, what if the host disconnects from the game? The best way to handle that would be to transfer the host status, but this was a bit too complicated for me, so I kind of just made it boot everyone back to the main menu. It's a better alternative than just getting a blank screen, which is what happened before that. Also, for lobby joining and creating, I felt that adding proper user feedback is essential to the user experience. So if you manage to create a lobby or join a lobby successfully, it gives you a positive message telling you that. If for some reason either of those fail, it will tell you why, which then can be used to ask me a more direct question on my itch.io page or my YouTube comment section, although I don't know how much help I would be, but yeah, we'll see. Something really notable to point out is that I had a big game-breaking bug when I did the test with my friend. So essentially, the door on the third room would not open even though all the zombies were dead. I first attempted to fix this with a really bad fix because I could not really figure out how to reproduce it. Eventually though, I would figure it out and I would get a solid fix working. I could just delete that horrible piece of code that I made earlier that attempted to fix it. The problem was that there was just this old piece of code that was just sitting there. I had completely forgotten about it, and it was setting the zombie count higher than it was supposed to be. So the zombie count never properly went to 0, which is a big issue considering the door checks for that. So the door would never activate.
It was an easy fix though. The enemy amount calculations had to be done before anything else. Since I was improving and fixing stuff anyway, I finally got around to working on the player manager.
Which honestly, I've been itching to do this for ages. It's so bad. It's so bad. Player manager now has separate lists for just the players and for players and player objects. This allows for easier usage of those lists and makes it so I don't have to sort through the lists as often. It certainly makes using it so much less annoying and takes away so much of my annoyance just knowing that that really bad piece of code just existed. Oh, and as for the enemy manager, I made it so that it no longer invokes the action whenever a zombie dies. I made it so that it only invokes it whenever the zombie count reaches 0. This should make it so that the room has to check less often if the door can be activated. Maybe it doesn't improve the performance at all, but still, this is a better system. Another thing though that felt really great to do was that I finally made it so that plants with dashing abilities can no longer shoot up into the sky. Anyway, it's time for the last thing before bug fixes: death handling. This is a lot easier with the improved player manager. Basically,
if the current game instance is single player, the death menu will just instantly appear. If it's multiplayer though, it checks if there are any active non-downed players. If there aren't, every client will see the death menu. This means that if all active players die, but there's still someone choosing a character, that person choosing the character will also see a death menu. This is to make sure that choosing a character cannot be used as a get out of jail free card.
Anyway, that's it. After months and months of struggling, this update is finally done. Well, I had about 21 bugs to fix after that, not to mention the numerous tweaks I still had to do, but you know, after that, it was done. Finally, really done. There's still a lot of work left for the third part. I do want to talk to you all about the future of this channel. The point of this channel is, and always has been, for me to pursue projects that interest me and then to share that journey with all of you. I appreciate the thousands of people that watched the first part and the hundreds that subscribed, but I do not want to get stuck working on this project. I sincerely enjoy it, but there were times where I was working on this part and I got so burnt out and I just wanted to work on other stuff. This project was always meant to be a trilogy, with a potential epilogue part in the future, after a while. I hope though that you all will stick with me here on this channel, even though I won't be touching this project for a while, for a long time, potentially a year or two after the trilogy is over. I will continue to work on interesting projects, not all of them game dev related, and hopefully you like me enough as a person to keep supporting this channel, even though I will not be working on the Plants vs Zombies RPG after the third part. That's all. Go into the description, try the game out, and I will see you all next time, which I guarantee you will not take as long as it did this time. I promise. Stay tuned.